Hi everyone, this is Dr. Nitin Chhoda, and in this training video I'm going to answer the question, is this the end of the US dollar as a reserve currency, as a global currency? Now remember, this is a complex subject. I'm going to do the best that I can. There are global, there are political, there are economic considerations at work, and this is a very complex subject that I'm going to try and crystallize into a short 10 to 15 minute video. So with that being said, let's get started. Before I start, if you're already a member of our community, welcome back. If you're not a member of our community, please consider subscribing and also enable the notifications icon so that you can get an instant update whenever I release a video. And also please click the like button because it helps the YouTube algorithm. Thanks so much. And with that being said, let's get started. Now, what is a global currency? A global currency is one that is accepted for trade throughout the world. You could go to any corner of the world and chances are they will accept that global currency. Now, there are almost 200 currencies in the world, but a majority of those currencies only work in those countries of which the currencies are a part of. However, there are three currencies that are essentially global currencies. One is the US dollar, the second is the euro, and the third is the Japanese yen. Another name for a global currency is reserve currency. Now, according to the International Monetary Fund, the US dollar is the most popular global currency. In fact, it is the reserve currency for the world. As of the last quarter of 2019, 60% of the central bank's foreign exchange reserves were held in US dollars. So essentially, the US dollar, it's like the most popular guy in the class. Now, if you had to take a guess as to the next in line, as to the second most popular global currency, would it be at 50%, 40%? Because you know the US dollar is at 60%. No other currencies even close. The closest currency is the euro, which is at 20% of the central bank foreign exchange reserve. So essentially, there's a wide gap between the US dollar and the euro, and the US dollar is essentially the most popular currency in the world, even though it's not pegged to the gold standard. The strength of the US economy under normal times, and I also believe when we bounce back from the crisis, will reinforce the standard of the US dollar being the reserve currency of the world. Now, in case you're wondering, maybe the euro can catch up, maybe the euro can become the world's reserve currency. After the recent Eurozone crisis, the confidence in the euro actually declined because because the world looked at the euro and said, hey, wait a minute, there's a whole bunch of different political entities, there's different countries, there's Brexit, there's this and that. And so the confidence in the euro has actually declined, which means the US dollar enjoys the confidence of the entire global economy. What does that mean to you if you're someone living in the United States watching this video? It simply means that the US dollar is the global currency of the world, and it is the strongest currency in the world, and it needs to remain stable, and it will remain stable. Otherwise, the whole world economy could collapse. Now, just to give you a sense of how powerful the US dollar is, the US dollar accounts for 90%. You heard that right, 90% of all foreign exchange transactions, and 2/3 of the global debt in the whole world is in US dollars. Virtually all international trades in oil are done in US dollars. This essentially means that if anything happens in America, let's say there's an economic crisis in America like there is right now, it's actually the biggest crisis we've ever faced. It tends to send shockwaves throughout the world. The decisions made in Washington, D.C., the sanctions that we can put on other countries, all the decisions we make about the trade decisions that we make, they tend to impact the rest of the world. They tend to create a ripple effect in economies around the world. The US can essentially do whatever it wants. The US can essentially print money if it wants, but other countries, like let's say India, for example, they can't just simply go and print money because that would devalue their currency. Now, I can tell you, I've seen a lot of questions about economic stimulus checks and such, and I even had a question from one of our subscribers asking, how is the economic crisis impacting other parts of the world? Now, I was born and raised in India. I moved to the United States in 2002, and I can tell you that in India, or in other countries, in most other countries, developing countries, there is no mechanism to directly send money to the average citizen. It simply doesn't exist, simply because the countries don't have that kind of economic capability. We in the US can essentially make our own rules. The decision that the Federal Reserve makes not only impacts the lives of all Americans, but in fact it impacts the global economy because of the strength of the US dollar. In fact, in 2018, there were $1,671 billion in circulation. We're actually talking hard currency. A lot of this money, a significant portion of this money is actually in Russia and in Latin America and is actually used as cash in day-to-day transactions. I mentioned oil trading earlier. 90% of forex trading, foreign exchange currency trading, is done in US dollars. So like I mentioned, there are almost 200 currencies in the world. There are actually exactly 185 currencies in the world, but most of them just work in their own countries. The US dollar is a single currency that at the moment works throughout the world. About 40% of the global debt in the world is issued in US dollars. That means foreign banks all over the world, need US dollars to function. In fact, during the 2008 financial crisis, when essentially the entire global economy came on the verge of collapse, non-American banks, that's all foreign banks, had $27 trillion in foreign currencies, and out of the $27 trillion, $18 trillion were in US dollars. As a result, the Federal Reserve actually had to step in and increase the limit for dollar swaps. The financial crisis of 2018 actually made the dollar more valuable, more useful, and more essential. In fact, three countries specifically, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, had more liabilities, had more debt on their balance sheet in US dollars than in their own currency. In fact, a lot of countries simply buy dollars because the dollar is such a safe investment, because it's backed by the strength of the US government. China and Japan in particular, they buy a lot of dollars and they have a lot of dollars in their foreign exchange reserves. For China, the US is the number one exporting partner, so China buys a lot of US dollars. And for Japan, the US is the number two trading partner, so Japan also buys a lot of dollars. So what's the bottom line here? The bottom line here is that the whole global economy, not just us in the United States, if you're one of my subscribers watching this video internationally, you know the strength of the US dollar. You know that you could pretty much go anywhere to any shop anywhere in the world and offer them the dollar and their eyes would light up. And I think we as Americans, for us watching here back at home, we need to understand that the strength of the dollar powers the rest of the world. What this fundamentally means is all the talks of the dollar no longer being the reserve currency, the end of the dollar, the start of digital currency, all of these concerns always seem to come up every 6 months to a year. There's always some sort of theory that, oh, it's going to be the end of the dollar. But I can tell you, with all the numbers I gave you, with the economic reality, with the global dependence on the dollar is not going away anytime soon. In fact, I don't see the dollar being replaced as a global currency for a long time, despite this crisis. In fact, if anything, the decisions that the Federal Reserve has taken, and I commend them for all the decisions they've taken, and the fact that the government is doing what they can, again, it's an imperfect system, we all know, but the fact that the government is doing all they can to get money to businesses, to get money to people, this is actually going to lead to a recovery of our economy, and it's going to lead to a strengthening of the dollar in the future. All the other countries, Russia, China, they can do whatever they want, but they are not going to be able to play catch up, simply because the ingrained dependence, the ingrained domination of the US dollar. So when did all this actually begin? In 1944. All the countries in the world met at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, and prior to that, all the currencies of the world were pegged to the gold standard, were pegged to gold reserves. In 1944 at Bretton Woods, a decision was made to make the US the reserve currency of the world and to make the US dollar the dominant currency. Now, at that time, the United States had the largest gold reserves in the world back in 1944. So as time went by, 20, 30 years went by, and by 1970, a lot of these countries were actually demanding gold in exchange for the dollars that they held. So what President Nixon decided at that time was, instead of trying to deplete the gold reserves at Fort Knox, President Nixon simply detached the dollar from the gold standard at that time. Remember, these countries wanted gold in exchange for the dollar to combat inflation, and President Nixon simply said that the dollar would no longer be tied to the gold standard, and this was a big decision. Now we fast forward to more than 50 years later. Despite trillions of dollars in debt, despite a growing deficit, which by the way is going to grow now with everything that's being done to prop up the economy, the United States dollar still enjoys the trust of the global community, is still the dominant currency of the world, and will continue to to be the reserve currency of the world for the foreseeable future. Now, as you can imagine, there are some countries like Russia and China that don't really like this. They don't believe that the world's economy should be pegged to one currency, the US dollar. So what they have been trying to push for is some sort of a global currency, some sort of a digital currency that can replace the dollar. But at this point, it's a concept and it doesn't seem like that'll go anywhere in the near future. In fact, with the crisis that's happened in the last couple of months with the pandemic going across all over the world, there has been a rush for the US dollar. There's been a big demand for the US dollar. Some investors obviously are rushing to gold, but no one's rushing to get the euro, no one's rushing to get the franc, no one's rushing to get the yen. Everyone wants the US dollar, which makes the US dollar even more valuable now. So essentially, the decisions again made by the Federal Reserve impact the whole global economy, and we, especially all my viewers, all my subscribers watching in America, you can take comfort in the fact that America pretty much with the financial decisions it makes controls the economic engine for the rest of the world, and by extension will and should be able to help everyone living in our country. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this domination isn't really something that other countries like Iran or like Russia enjoy. In fact, Russia is creating a push for what is called as de-dollarization. Russia doesn't want to be dependent on the dollar. In fact, Putin specifically said, we aren't ditching the dollar is ditching us. So I get a lot of questions asking, is the dependence on the dollar, is the influence of the dollar shrinking? Are we going to see a weaker dollar? Are we going to see countries say, I don't want the dollar? Let me ask you a question. What do you need to build a house? You need a foundation, you need frames, you need windows, you need doors, you need plumbing, you need electrical, you need sheetrock. Think of the dollar as the framework of the global economy. Think of all the other currencies as little bits of furniture in the house. That is how important the US dollar is. And once again, the US dollar isn't going anywhere. It's going to remain strong. I personally have complete faith in the US dollar. And I think we all, especially all of us subscribers watching here in the US, should take some comfort in that fact as well. Now, I mentioned about Forex trades earlier. According to the Bank of International Settlements, the currency trades that were back in 2018 were roughly around 88%. The currency trades in 2019 that were done in US dollars were close to 89%. So basically, more and more people are using the US dollar in everything from oil trading to foreign exchange currency trading. Again, the US dollar is not going anywhere. Now, is it going to be easy for currencies to switch away from the dollar towards some other currency like the euro? Not really. It's going to be extremely challenging because the entire system, the entire infrastructure, the entire architecture will need to be changed. Now, Russia is trying though. Now, in terms of foreign exchange reserves, Russia has 30% of their foreign exchange reserves in euros and only 23% of their foreign exchange reserves in dollars. They've actually been sort of chipping away at this to try and reduce their dependence on the US dollar. But it's not going to be easy because, again, the rest of the world depends on the US dollar. The euro has also overtaken the dollar for Russia when it trades with the European Union. But all of this comes with disadvantages to Russia. For example, in March, when the dollar rallied, because as a result of this crisis, people rushed to the dollar and the dollar became stronger, the value of Russia's international reserves, because their reduced dependence on the dollar, actually shrunk by 5% in 1 week because they had disassociated themselves from the dollar. Now, Russia is not the only country trying to reduce its dependence on the dollar and trying to essentially dethrone the dollar as a currency reserve of the world. China also has made a decision to start promoting the yuan, the Chinese yuan, as a reserve currency, as a currency that can be freely traded without any government restrictions like there were in the past, because the Chinese government has traditionally had a lot of restrictions and a lot of control over the yuan. The problem is, in 2019, only 4% of all transactions, of all foreign exchange transactions occurred in the Chinese yuan. And that's a problem for China, and that's great for us as Americans. In fact, China started something called the Belt Rust Initiative, and that isn't going very well for China at the moment. Because of everything that's going on around the world, a lot of these countries who've actually borrowed money from China under the BRI, the Belt Rust Initiative, are basically saying to China, hey, I don't have money to pay you back. So in this kind of situation, China usually takes over the asset, but now they're like, oh, wait a minute, I can't take over this asset because there's nothing there. There's no income coming from there. So China essentially may have to write off a lot of bad loans made to countries as a result of this crisis. The US doesn't have and it doesn't have this extent of problems. So all in all, as you can see, I'm a patriot, I'm a supporter of the US dollar, and I don't think the US dollar is going anywhere. In fact, if anything, I think the US dollar is going to get stronger as a result of this entire crisis. I think we as a country, as we emerge from this, we're going to lead the way for the rest of the world. Now, I'm going to give you my closing thoughts in just a second, but if you benefited from this training, please click the like button. Please click the subscribe button, and also please enable notifications so you get instant updates. Please also comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the strength of the dollar. Now, there have been some talks of some sort of a global digital super currency, and I know there are a lot of Bitcoin fans out there. There is a push from some individuals and some countries to have a global digital super currency. But at this point, that's just a concept. The entire world economy is essentially entrenched with the US dollar. Even if the Federal Reserve were to print more money, they could hypothetically do so in a way that could preserve the strength of the US dollar. And I'm not going to pretend to be as smart as the Fed, because I'm not, but I can tell you that the decisions that the Fed has made, the Federal Reserve, the decisions that have been made by the gang, Jerome Powell and gang, have been simply phenomenal. And they have not only propped up the United States, they have not only helped create more liquidity in our economy, they've also essentially propped up the rest of the world, because again, the rest of the world, banks all over the world, are dependent on the US dollar. At a time like this, the world needs leadership. The world is seeing that leadership from the Federal Reserve. I think the world should also see that leadership from us as Americans. I want us to be strong. We'll get through this. I know that a lot of what I've said does not put food on the table, doesn't help to pay your rent, but I can tell you that economically, we are the engine that drives the rest of the world. Like I said, like I mentioned at the start of this video training, I was born and raised in India. I can tell you that right now, as you're watching this video, there are poor villagers in India. They're not getting the money from the government that they deserve. Some of them are, because the Indian government is doing what they can. But the systems that exist in the United States, the ability to deposit money, the ability to mail a check, the ability to get unemployment, they do not exist in other countries. Right now, there are some poor villagers in another part of the world, and I think you need to realize that those individuals are now walking many miles just for food and water, simply because they have no money to buy food. So relative to the rest of the world, I think by virtue of us being in the US, we are at a disadvantage, simply because of the underlying economic structure, simply because of the fact that America is a superpower, simply by virtue of its global reserve currency status, and many other things, obviously. But I want us to recognize this, and I want us to appreciate this. Again, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please click the like button. Please click subscribe below and enable notifications. If you have any questions or comments, please go ahead and type them below. I appreciate you all. We'll get through this. We'll lead the way for the rest of the world. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next training video.